the roots of Black women's history. And in here we're going to be talking about the history of Black women, so the history about Black women, and also Black women doing history, so Black women being historians. So a little bit of each. 19th century history becomes professional, and this is when people actually start getting paid money to have a job as a historian at a university. And the original version of this, it's very much focused on being document-based, particularly government documents, but other kinds of documents as well. And of course that limits what you're going to do, because historically what ends up in archives is often stuff produced by the government or the products of wealthy people, usually white. And so there's sort of a limit to the kind of stuff that gets covered in archives, particularly in the past. More than that, you were supposed to be objective. And the goal was to be neutral, disinterested, judges of what happened, not advocates. So you want to be objective. You want to focus on the real important things like politics and war and similar male activities. Finally, it was a period in which scientific racism and Southern apologists dominated the field. Ulrich B. Phillips was the historian who basically dominated the history of the South and slavery. He argued that slavery was an idealized system where planters worked to take care of and shelter childlike Negroes, and they all worked in harmony together. And Black women were wantonly sexual and promiscuous. And his attitudes dominated histories of slavery until 1956, when Kenneth Stamp published The Peculiar Institution. So there's not a lot of room there for a Black woman to be writing from her point of view. And if she did write from her point of view, she would be seen as being not objective and being passionate and all the things that a good historian wasn't supposed to be. Black women, however, that doesn't mean they kept out of history. Instead, what they did was they did popular Black history. And an essential part of what they were doing, they saw themselves as defending their community, bringing history about Black people out to defend Black people, defend their community. And so, for example, as they're trying to do this work of racial pride and inspiration, and a lot of these women were self-taught, they write novels. So, for example, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper wrote novels about slavery and Reconstruction with strong Black heroines. Pauline Hopkins, a number of other women, wrote novels as an accessible way of sharing history with a broader audience, a Black audience, but maybe also to some extent a white audience as well. Librarians played an important role in collecting and archiving materials of Black history. And a particular example of that is Schomburg collection in New York City, but there's others as well. And like I was talking about before, not having the archival materials, this is fighting for the archival materials to be there to help people do history about Black people. You also have people who write histories for a popular audience. Monographs, pamphlets, magazine articles. Often school teachers, club women, social reformers, journalists would write these histories drawing on oral history. Things that people told them about the past and their experiences. And of course, there was the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which was founded in 1915. And the leadership was all male, but in actual fact, women did a huge amount of the work behind the scenes. They were officially supposed to be collecting history where the men were the ones who interpreted it and wrote about it, but they did a lot of that as well. They collected documents, they raised funds, they wrote community histories, and they're the ones who really put the work into creating the first Negro History Week possible. So a lot of Black women out there doing popular black history, so trying to bring history there and make it available to people. There were some black women who tried to get through academia. The first black woman to get a doctorate was Anna Julia Cooper, who won a doctorate in Paris in 1925, doctorate in history. And Marion Thompson Wright got the first doctorate in history in the United States at Columbia in 1940. By the mid-1950s, under 10 women had earned doctorates in history total. 10 black women had earned doctorates in history total. The problem was that in the first half of the 20th century, black women were excluded from many of the schools, and when they were able to get into schools, they were really directed into feminine professions. School teacher, nurse, librarian, social worker, things that were thought of being appropriate for women to do and for black women to do. The first women who got doctorates wrote well-documented histories. They published often in the Journal of Negro History and the Journal of Negro Education, though some managed to publish in other journals as well. They were extremely well-documented histories, but they weren't about the history of black women because that was seen as not objective enough. And so they were even a little cautious in their dealings with black history, trying to keep that proper academic professional image there. And of course they faced a great deal of discrimination. They often could not attend conferences because they were held in segregated cities with segregated hotels. It was hard to get in the archives. They often faced discrimination in terms of access to archives, faced discrimination by journals. 1895 to 1980, the American Historical Review, main journal of the profession, had published only one article by a black scholar. That was W.B. Du Bois in 1910. The Journal of American History, the other leading journal, between 1945 and 1975 only published 3 articles by black scholars. So it was really hard to get published. So in addition to the racial discrimination these women faced, they also faced sexual discrimination. Often they couldn't get jobs because they were female, or if they married, they lost their jobs. There was sexual harassment. They were excluded often from programs, boards, events, committees. In 1970, there were no female full professors in history anywhere. They were also, however, not included because they were black in the white female activities. So one of the big ones was the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, and they weren't allowed to attend that. Similarly, black women were not hired at white women's colleges, which was a place where some white women professors could get jobs. And in fact, even at the beginning of the black female colleges, the 2 that existed, they initially were hiring more white women than black women, though that changed over time. So black women generally had found themselves confined and either excluded or confined to second-class status in black historical organizations and treated quite badly even at black universities and colleges. The thing, though, that these women did, even though they faced all of this discrimination, they served as mentors for black female scholars. So there's sort of this first generation that goes there, and they play an important role in providing the mentorship that's going to let that next generation come through and maybe go a little bit further than they were able to with all the challenges that they faced. Things begin to change with the new social history in the 1960s and 1970s. People are beginning to write what they call history from the bottom up. And they want to look at the historical experiences of people who had been previously marginalized by the traditional emphasis on politics and war. So they want to look at women, they want to look at African Americans, Native Americans. There are also people who write about even the history of the mentally ill. So a wide variety of people are being brought back in. The thing is that in these new histories, you have a problem from the point of view of black women. The problem is this, is that usually they begin by focusing on the exceptional example of the white woman or the black man. So Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, these leading figures that are seen as exemplary and special. Over time, though, people begin to start saying, well, maybe we should look at a little bit, go deeper and try to find out more about the people who are being excluded. And some of the people who are starting to do that are usually black women, but a few white women who are starting to look for the history of black women themselves. And these are some of the pioneers: Darlene Clark Hines, Marlene Pitre, Rosalind Chipper Penn, Deborah Gray White, Nell Irvin Painter, some of the pioneers in the field. They, however, faced a very difficult situation. Universities have been forced to open up and include both women and African Americans, but that didn't make it easy for black women. They got access to it, and you start having black and female students and eventually professors, but usually there's the black study programs and there's the women study programs. And depending on the situation, if you had a joint appointment in both of those, you might be the only black person in the women's studies program and the only woman in the black studies program. So you'd be isolated in both of them. And often you would face yourself being pushed to have, basically, whose side are you on? Constance Carroll, not a historian, but she was a black woman who was a president of a small college in California in 1982, is quoted as telling herself, "You must be better qualified than the men. You must be more articulate. You must be more aggressive. You must have more stamina to face inevitable attacks and setbacks. You must have more patience since you will advance more slowly. Above all, you must remain feminine and not appear threatening." It's pretty much an impossible dilemma to do all of that at the same time. 1980s is when everything changes. And then you have, in history, 3 books that came out in 1985. And these are the books that I was told in the 1990s that you had to read to understand black women's history, because this was pretty much it. Deborah Gray White's Aren't I a Woman? Female Slaves in the Plantation South. Paula Giddings' When and Where I Enter, The Impact of Black Women on Race and Sex in America. And Jacqueline Jones' Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow, Black Women Work in the Family from Slavery to the Present. And of those, both Deborah Gray White and Paula Giddings are African American. Jacqueline Jones is a white woman. But this was extremely path-breaking work. Deborah Gray White remembered writing her dissertation, which is the first version of Aren't I a Woman, and being criticized because she wasn't using enough plantation sources, which really didn't talk about black women, and instead she was using the WPA interviews that were done in the 30s of former slaves that she had found had a lot of material about enslaved black women. And she was criticized because that wasn't seen as the correct kind of records. More than that, she was criticized basically for a lot of things. And at the time, she didn't see racism or sexism in any of the critiques she got. She just felt like she had to do better and improve, but work very hard. But she explained, but it was a very painful process because I was rewriting in response to critiques that alleged I had not done enough work in the proper sources, and I knew I could spend a lifetime and still not be able to do what was demanded. It was painful because I was rewriting without a language that expressed the interdependence of race and gender. And I was rewriting without guidance from someone who had done this before, and a climate at the best was benevolent disinterest. She actually failed her first defense, had to go back and redo it. The book was rejected by multiple presses that said she didn't have enough proof. There wouldn't be an audience for a book about enslaved women. She had to desperately publish it for tenure and only found a publisher at the last minute just in time to save her. This is when you have new books coming out that begin to say, look, Black history isn't all about men. Women's history isn't all about white women. It's interesting, though, that part of what this is it has to be a transformation not just in what we pay attention to, who we're looking at, but also where we get our sources. Because frequently Black women just aren't in the traditional sources. Sometimes they can find them, and historians have done amazing work using sources that you would think don't tell you about Black women and finding ways to use them to talk about them, sometimes simply by the fact that they're absent, but also finding other kinds of sources and using them in creative ways as well, such as the WPA narratives. So it's not just a change in who you write about, it's a change in how you do history. The other thing that has to happen is it's a matter of building connections, because African American women found themselves so isolated, they had to start coming up with ways to find connections with each other and build those connections to sustain them. So they found in 1979 the Association of Black Women Historians, which is around and thriving today as a way to come in contact with and know other Black women historians, classmates, colleagues, mentors. And if you read, and this is always something that's interesting to do with historians' books, if you read the acknowledgments, you'll get a real sense of the networks that women create of classmates, of colleagues, of mentors, of people who support them in doing this work. And so by the 1990s, we have women who are now looking at both new materials, but also looking at multiple levels of oppression. Instead of simply looking at race or sex, they're looking at how they combine and create a distinctive experience for Black women.